Well, good morning and welcome to the final programme in our series, Our Island Heritage, where once again we're delighted to welcome to this series Mr. Marshall Cubbon, the Director of the Manx Museum and National Trust. Very good morning again.
Well, good morning, it's nice to be with you again.
Thank you. Now, we're at Craignish today for the Craignish Folk Museum, and I think before we go into any detail on it, Mr. Cubbon, of course it's been in the news recently because of this, the only award in the island for the European Architectural Heritage here, hasn't it?
Yes, that's right. The Trust with the Electricity Board and the Post Office telephones, it was a cooperative venture, received an award for the undergrounding of the electricity supply cables and overhead telephone cables that were, I'm afraid, formerly all too much a feature of the landscape at Craignish. And the village, of course, looks enormously more real without that 20th century intrusion. From here, we're up on the road that climbs up to the hill above the chasms. We're looking north towards Craignish, and we get a very good impression of its setting from here. And the setting of Craignish is an absolutely vital part of the whole museum operation. Craignish, of course, is an upland crofting village, not a village in the English sense of that word, but more correctly it's a loose cluster of crofters, houses and cottages. The Western Scottish or Northern Irish term would be clachan, which is a more fitting description of Craignish. And from here you can see quite a number of the houses still have their traditional thatched roofs and whitewashed walls, and beyond the land rises to the Mull Hill, and out to the left you see the characteristic old field pattern of long narrow fields running away towards Spanish Head, and way in the distance we can look out and see the Calf of Man.
I was going to say too, perhaps in case people don't realise that Craignish is not just a folk museum, it is a living village as well, isn't it?
Very much so, and it's very much the intention of the Manx Museum and National Trust that it should remain so. Certain of the buildings within the village have been acquired, of course, and developed as an open-air folk museum, but quite a lot of the houses are privately owned, and quite a number of the houses that are owned by the Trust are in fact let. Their external appearance is preserved, of course, as part of the setting of the folk museum, but internally they've been made more comfortable.
Yeah. Well, what sort of period would we be talking about in Manx history when Craignish would be, a village of croft, as you see, with the thatched cottages?
Well, it really sort of gives a picture of the end of the last century, the end of the 19th century, but it represents a pattern of life that goes very, very much further back than that. It is, in many respects, the traditional pattern of life of the Manx countryside in former generations, and of course before, say, the middle of the 19th century, the majority of the population of the Isle of Man lived in the country. They didn't live in the town. So it is from the farmer's cottage and the farmhouse that most of the Manx men and women of former times developed.
What would the way of life be? Were they mainly crofters? But I think the fishing would come into it too, wouldn't it? From this village.
Yes. The crofting was important. They were eking out a fairly simple form of life from the thin acid soil in this part of the island, and the community could hardly have been economically viable without the additional benefit of income from fishing. And the traditional pattern of life, of course, was that the menfolk went went to the fishing, as the saying went, in the summer months, and the women would be looking after the craft and running the craft from while the men were away, and the men folk would be coming back again in the autumn in time for the harvest.
Now, I'm sure during the summer months when the museum is actually open, it's just as popular as the Manx Museum in Douglas. How many people visit it during the season?
Well, we now have, the numbers have been building up steadily, and we now have about 16,000 visitors in the summer. I would stress, of course, that Craignish is not open at this time of year. We have extended the season now, and both here and at the Nautical Museum, and we're open from mid-May until the end of September.
And of course you have a very good guidebook for visitors, and you also have the taped commentary that they can sort of wander around themselves and learn everything about it, haven't you?
Yes, at Craignish it's possible to hire a little lightweight tape recorder and have a recorded commentary, and as you say, there's a printed guidebook as well if people prefer to do it that way. And of course we have an attendant on duty, and in Harry Kelly's cottage in particular, who is able to answer questions as well.
That brings me to the point I was going to say. I suppose when you talk about Craignish Folk Museum, Harry Kelly's cottage is the centrepiece, so shall we go down and have a look there now in more detail?
Yes, let's do that.
Well, we've now moved down and standing outside Harry Kelly's cottage, and Mr. Cubbon, this is the genuine article, isn't it, without any doubt?
Yes, this indeed. Harry Kelly was a real person. He lived here in Craignish up to the mid-1930s, and after he died, a little group of enthusiasts acquired his cottage, and with the opening of Harry Kelly's cottage in 1938, the Isle of Man had the first publicly owned open-air folk museum in the British Isles. We've been followed, of course, by a good many areas since then, and the fine open-air folk museums of Wales and Ulster in particular are very highly developed and splendid institutions.
But would it be fair to say that this is the only one in the British Isles really in a natural setting?
This is true, I think, yes, or certainly on this scale. The other big ones, following what occurs in quite a number of continental countries, have moved buildings bodily, stone by stone, and rebuilt them very, very accurately in what's sometimes termed a folk park. Great one outside Stockholm, for example. The buildings themselves are perfect, but of course their setting isn't always right. And here, as I was saying earlier, the setting at Craignish is as important as the actual buildings themselves, and it's one of the great strengths of the Craignish operation.
Before we talk about the cottage, now I notice in the garden you have sort of a small thatch. Is that sort of covering the peat?
Yes, that's right. That's the turf stack. It's a little thatched roof over the stack of turf, as we call it in the Isle of Man, peat, which was, of course, the traditional fuel in days gone by. And also in the garden we have the traditional Manx herbs growing.
Yeah. Now the main feature, I suppose you could say, is the thatched roof, isn't it? How often do these have to be rethatched?
Well, this is one of the very real practical difficulties, of course. The traditional Manx thatch does not last long. On average, we only get about 5 years out of a thatched roof, and we have 10 thatched roofs now in Craignish to keep up. And in these days, it's not easy to get thatchers. Our own staff do our thatching. It's not easy to get thatching straw. And it's also not easy to get weather that's suitable for thatching.
True enough.
Because it has to be a really calm day.
Yeah, it's really an expert, isn't it? Do you find now that your own staff must be able to do it?
Yes, this is true. The Manx thatching is quite distinctive. This particular kind of thatching is really only found in northeastern Ireland and southwestern Scotland, as well as the Isle of Man. And it's very different from the reed thatching of southern England or indeed the traditional thatching of most of Ireland.
Yeah. So the art of thatching within the island, really, you're keeping alive by having your men trained to do this.
Well, yes, we're helping. There are private thatchers as well, of course, and every benefit to them.
Yeah. Just before we move in through the door, there's a field opposite us here, and I believe that there's a fair attraction here in the summer with the Lochtan sheep you have.
Well, that's right, yes. They're not here now, of course,
No.
but the Manx Museum and National Trust does own a flock of Lochtan sheep, and the main flock is kindly looked after for us by Mr. Jackie Quine at Druidale Farm. But in the summer we bring down a few Lochtans here to Craignish, and they are a great attraction for the visitors. In fact, I think the film companies ought to give us a bit of a subsidy, the amount of film that's blazed up trying to photograph the Lochtans.
Yes. Anyway, should we have a walk in through the front door now, and
Yes,
I'll let you lead the way.
Just as we go in,
Yes.
can I point out the traditional thatch of wheat straw, covered with a fishing net, and then tied down with ropes to these stone pegs that are projecting out from the outside of the wall.
Yes, and when you sort of feel it, it's very, very thin and brittle, and yet,
Well,
as a roof together, it's very solid.
oh yes, when it's well thatched, it's perfectly watertight, all right. Now, coming inside, we can look up and see the inside of the thatched roof, because of it's not covered in any way, and you see underneath the actual thatch of straw there is a layer of scrays, as we call them, long strips of sod, turf sod, that are laid over the roof, over the ridge of the roof, and down to the top of the walls, just like strips of felt.
I think the most impressive thing when you come in is the big open sort of fire. You couldn't call it a fireplace, a fire area, isn't it?
Well, yes. This is the cholach, the absolute centerpiece of every Manx house, with the great lintel. Of course, Spanish Head was a splendid area for quarrying fine long lintels, and the cholach here in Harry Kelly's cottage is typical. The fire, the turf fire, would be burning on the hearth stone, no grate at all, and above the fire there is the slowry, the pot hook that's hanging down from a fixture in the chimney, and the pot could be hung on that above the turf fire.
Yeah. And of course, the big dresser here again is another important part of
Yes,
of the cottage, isn't it?
the great pride of the woman of the house, as she was called, the mother. Not that the china was locally made, of course, but the Isle of Man being an island and people going away so much, it was very much the pattern to bring back treasures for mother to put on the dresser.
Yeah.
And the spinning wheel there was again a feature of her pattern in the life style of the house.
No, I notice it's one big area which is sort of divided. The bedroom is just the other side as you come in through the door, but you seem to have a half loft. Is this sort of traditional in this type of cottage?
Yes, that's so. It's distinct from the rather larger Quarterland farms where you would have a complete upstairs, so to speak. In these crofter cottages, there's just a half loft over the bedroom area, and the children would have slept up there, and it was also used for storage and so on. You see a typical mollig, a dog skin, which was a net float hanging from the rafters above the half loft.
Yeah. As you say, this is the main centrepiece, but just in the few minutes we have left on this part of the programme, this is the centrepiece, but there are also other, the smithy, for instance, and one or two more places, aren't there?
Yes.
Within Craignish itself.
Yes, Craignish has developed far beyond Harry Kelly's cottage. There is a danger of Manx people thinking of Craignish as just Harry Kelly's, but in fact there is a turner's shop with a treadle lathe from the north of the island. There's a weaver's shed with a hand loom from the south of the island, from Malafesan, and as you say, there's a smithy reconstruction and also a crofter's farmstead, so that it really does give a picture of the old traditional way of life in the Isle of Man.
A wealth of history in a natural setting.
That's exactly it.
Fine. Well, I think we're going to stay in the south of the island for part 2 of the programme and go along and have a look now at the other attraction in the south, the Nautical Museum.
Fine, good.
Well, indeed, we've now moved the few miles from the Craignish Folk Museum into the Nautical Museum in Castletown, and I think, Mr. Cubbon, it's fair to say that the Nautical Museum is famous because of Peggy.
Well, yes, the Peggy is undoubtedly the centrepiece of the Nautical Museum, and really a quite remarkable survival. Indeed, I remember that the director of the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich once said to me that the Nautical Museum in Castletown, because of the Peggy, must rank as one of the top 10 nautical museums of Europe. This is a claim that I would never have dreamed of making myself, but it does give some indication of the importance of the Peggy in terms of nautical history generally. She has survived here in her own contemporary boat cellar right through from the end of the 18th century. And it is a fascinating story that she should still be in existence and in such a remarkably good state.
Perhaps you'd like to give us some more details on the story.
Yes, well, here in the entrance hall you see a model of the Peggy as she would appear when the masts were up and she was rigged, because of course you don't get this impression seeing her in her boat cellar. No. She was built by George Quail of Castletown, one of the Quails of Bridge House, influential 18th century Manx family, in 1791. She was in fact the second boat that he built, the second of three, and both the second and the third were called Peggy, just to confuse the issue. But the Peggy that has survived here is in fact the first Peggy that was built in 1791. And when he became interested in the sea, he built himself a little boathouse attached to what was originally the coach house of the family home alongside Castletown Harbour. And then when he built our Peggy, he extended the boathouse. He had to make it a bit bigger in order to accommodate his new boat. And she is a clinker-built, schooner-rigged yacht. She was armed. Her little cannon you see just through here, through the doorway. And here in this rigged model you see the mounted little cannon on the gunwale. The story is a little more complicated, the structural story, because she was in fact, her gunwale level was raised at one stage late in her working life. And then after George Quail's time, throughout much of the last century, she lay virtually forgotten and unknown in her boat cellar. Here, the family, of course, knew she was there, but it was just old Uncle George's boat in the boathouse, and she was unknown to the outside world, to all intents and purposes, until the 1930s, when she created great excitement in the nautical world, when she became more generally known. And then during the Second World War, the descendants of the Quail family, then living in the south of England, very generously offered the Manx Museum trustees the Peggy. This is before my time at the museum, of course, but the museum trustees said, thank you very much for this generous offer, but A, we've got nowhere to put her, and B, she is literally walled up in her boathouse. Wouldn't you like to give the boathouse as well? And I'm very glad to say that the family did agree to this suggestion. And so it came to the Manx Museum, and it was after the war, of course, before she could be restored, though she was in a remarkably good state and called for very little restoration, just the keel and one strake that had been lying on the damp floor of the cellar needed replacement. And the boathouse was opened up as a branch museum in 1951, and then we extended it substantially in 1967.
So that's 175 years that she's been connected with the boat cellar below us here.
Well, that's right. Shall we go through and see the Quail room?
We will indeed. Let's walk through that way now.
Well, here we are in the Quail room, where you see there is a photocopy of an illustration of George Quail himself, a very interesting, curious character, travelled extensively as a young man to the Near East, Turkey and so on, rather different from the usual grand tour of the 18th century.
Yes.
And around the walls you see photocopies of contemporary accounts for the building of the boathouse and indeed for his first ship. He was quite an inventor. He had his own little workshop here in the loft above us. And just as an illustration of his inventive turn of mind, you see here on the left a hidden panel, as it was originally, in the wall, in which he had a design for constructing an invasion barge to invade Napoleonic France at the 1790s, early 1800s, designed to transport 30,000 troops in one go across the English Channel.
Which is something that even wasn't done in the 1940s.
Perhaps Eisenhower could have used the idea. Yes. Now, passing through into the next room, which is, I suppose, certainly the most attractive part of the Nautical Museum, this is the so-called cabin room, and as you see, it is built to simulate the appearance of a stern cabin of a large ship of the Nelson period. See the sloping windows and the chart lockers and the curve of the ceiling, giving the impression of the deck above. And we can picture George Quail and his friends and cronies perhaps carousing here on a winter night and getting the charts out and planning where they were going to sail the Peggy when the better weather came along in the spring.
It certainly gives a very fine impression of being on board a ship, doesn't it?
Yes, it's really a remarkable restoration. And there's a very nice letter from one of George Quail's brothers, that we have in the library in the Manx Museum. It's a letter of 1791, just when the boathouse was being extended and this cabin room was built above the boat cellar below. And an extract from it reads, "The boathouse is growing apace. The apartment over it will be quite an oddity. The interior alterations, ornaments, and decorations are not to be described to the vulgar until finished, and even then to be seen only by the elect."
Beautiful quotation from that letter, isn't it?
Well, it does give a picture of the sort of social scene of the end of the 18th century.
This is very true indeed. Yes.
It's rather nice to think that it's now open to the general public.
Yes. Well, I think no visit to the Nautical Museum would be complete without going downstairs and actually seeing the Peggy herself.
No, let's
Fine,
do that.
let's do that.
Well, here we are in the boat cellar, and there is the Peggy herself. You'd hardly believe she dates from 1791, would you?
You would not.
Because she is in such a remarkably good state. She's now chalked up, of course, on wooden cradles to raise her above the floor of the cellar, and she fits just comfortably within the cellar. Her masts, of course, are stepped, and you see them there, the two masts bracketed on the far wall. And then from the little inspection platform you can look down inside her and see internal lines, and see one of the remarkable features of the Peggy, the slots that of all that survive of her sliding keels. Again, we're helped by the contemporary letters that survive from the family that were also presented to the Manx Museum. And it's clear from these that George Quail was experimenting with sliding keels, as they were termed, that is, the principle of the modern adjustable centreboard,
yes,
which was, of course, a brand new idea at this time. Both the British and French navies were still in the experimental stage in relation to this idea, and George Quail developed developed it and included it in the design of his Peggy.
Yeah. He certainly must have been ahead of his time, quite a character.
Yes, I think perhaps a slightly eccentric, offbeat sort of person, but certainly, as you say, well ahead of his time.
Yeah, I noticed too on the stern that you can actually just see that the Peggy, the name etched in gold very slightly.
Yes, you can see the two periods, as I mentioned. Her gunwale was raised, and you can see the two periods of design on the transom of the stern.
Yeah. Now, one question I must ask you, does she ever get wet now?
Well, we thought the answer to that should be no when we got her chocked up here, but in fact, you see, beyond the boat cellar, there is a little walled area which originally was an enclosed dock.
Yes.
The slipway of the boat cellar slopes down into the dock, and then from the far side of Castletown Harbour, you can still see the archway now blocked up, through which the Peggy would have sailed from her dock out into the harbour. And at high tide, of course, the tide still does rise up in the dock area. The shingle that you see out there is covered with water at high spring tides. And in fact, a few years back, when we had an exceptionally high tide and an inshore gale blowing into Castletown Harbour, the water level actually rose to the point of touching the Peggy, so she hadn't quite lost contact with her natural element.
True. Well, time is running out. I know we've talked a lot about the Peggy. I think it is the highlight, but there is quite a lot else to see in the Nautical Museum, isn't there?
Yes, the Nautical Museum has got other things to illustrate. In particular, it aims to give a picture of the nautical story of the Isle of Man in the days of sail. And that particularly relates, of course, to fishing and also to coastal craft. And we have a good selection of ship models, including a model of a square sail, the earliest type of Manx fishing boat, obviously a direct descendant of the Viking longship, really. Clinker-built, one central mast on one great sail. And we also, I suppose, after the Peggy herself, the most important exhibit in the Nautical Museum is the punt of the Bonnie Lass, presented to us by Mr. John Gorn, formerly of Fisted. As far as we know, the only surviving punt of a Manx Nicky. And it's a great treasure here at the Nautical Museum in Castletown.
Well, Mr. Cubbon, can I say many thanks indeed, not only for joining us on this programme, but for the whole series. I'm sure it's been enjoyed by our listeners. We appreciate your time, and I hope perhaps in the not-too-distant future we may take again a look into our island heritage.
Thank you. Can I just remind you once again that the two branch museums, Craignish and the Nautical Museum Castletown, are not open at the present. They'll be opening again in mid-May.
Fine. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.